Hello friends, Ken here, and today I wanted to talk to you about Anthem, and specifically the two demos slash betas they've been running for Anthem over the past couple of weekends. I played a ton of them when I was actually able to log in, which we'll talk about in a minute, and I wanted to give my overall impressions and let you know whether I thought the game was going to be worth your time at release. So if you're not familiar with it, it's the latest game from BioWare and EA, a company, BioWare, that has been responsible for some incredibly popular sort of story-based RPG franchises, Knights of the Old Republic, Mass Effect, Dragon Age, that kind of thing. But now they're doing a kind of Destiny loot shooter, and that's what Anthem is all about. So I spent quite a lot of time playing it both on PlayStation 4 and PC over the course of both weekends. I ended up preferring playing it with a controller. The ground combat feels quite nice with mouse and keyboard, but flying around is weirdly swimmy on the mouse and you do a lot of flying. And some of the combat skills need you to hold down a button, and that's awkward to do on a keyboard because it impacts your use of moving around with the WASD. But on controller, on PS4, I got up to level 15, the max you could in the demos. I did quite a lot of open world exploration on the harder difficulty settings, and it ended up maxing out my gear for two of the classes, the Colossus and the Ranger. Before we get too much into the actual specifics of the game, I want to talk about the connectivity issues, because that was really the talking point. The major talking point is all of the technical flaws that were going on. Initially, when they started their VIP pre-order to get into this demo, a lot of people weren't able to connect at all, and if you finally were able to get into the servers, a lot of people were having an issue, and I had this on both PS4 and PC, where the loading screen would crash about 95% of the way through, and you would have to quit the game and reload. And to its credit, when you quit and reload, it would put you back in the right session with the same players, which is nice. But it shouldn't have been crashing in the first place, and that was a huge issue. Seems like they solved that for the second weekend, for the public demo. I heard a couple of people saying they had it, but for the most part, it seems like they rectified that issue and they seem to know what the problem was there. But still a ton of connectivity issues, and in fact that kind of manifested into the gameplay as well. Not only was it difficult to get into the server sometimes, but actually in game there would be occasional lag, it would feel kind of frame droppy, and it was difficult to tell if it was just a performance issue or a server issue, but sometimes it ran fine, and that leads me to believe that it's probably more of a server issue. I also ran into an issue quite frequently, especially in the free roam mode, where I would engage an enemy and then it would just vanish without me killing it. And it was difficult to tell if it was a case of the encounter trying to reset because I'd started off a fight, or if it was a connectivity issue, but regardless of what was causing it, it's very jarring. The other big server problem I ran into was I had a couple of instances where my loadouts would disappear or be reset. A few times it was the sort of visual customization of my mech I just lost completely and had to remake from scratch, which is kind of frustrating because I put a lot of time into making my mech look cool and suddenly I had to do it all over again. And a couple of times I loaded into maps and I just didn't have some of my equipment equipped, which is strange. So that was a problem. Hopefully that gets rectified for launch, but I guess if you want a quick, sort of no-frills takeaway before I even get into the gameplay, the server issues make it pretty difficult to recommend out the gate. You know, I would always say be wary of pre-ordering anything, but I know particularly as this is a multiplayer game, a lot of people will be wanting to get in with their friends and play it at the same time. And I would say to those people, just say to your friends, hey, let's wait for week 1, let's wait for week 2, see what people who do buy it say about the server issues, because if this stuff is cropping up in the main game, you know, if you're having to quit and reload to get into missions, if you're having to go back to Fort Tarsis and go into the Forge to change your loadout, not because you want to mix up what you're doing, but because it just broke and got rid of some of your equipment, then that's a real problem, and I would be very hesitant at recommending this game out the gate. That said, there is a ton of stuff I really did enjoy. I think there is potential in this game. I would say, you know, don't buy it out the gate, basically, because the server issues and the technical side of things have been so spotty. But I want to talk about some of the things I did like and some of the things I didn't, and where I think this game could be really fun. And having said that, I actually want to start with something I didn't like that much, which is Fort Tarsis, the kind of main hub area. Initially, in the first weekend, you walked so slowly, just trudging around this area. You know, this is where you're going to go and chat to NPCs and learn the story stuff. It's kind of like Destiny's Tower. And in fact, like Destiny's original tower, it feels a little bit lifeless. There's quite a few people around, but they all are just kind kind of standing in fixed positions. There's a couple of people that walk back and forth, but they're the same people walking back and forth, and all the NPCs you talk to stand pretty stock still in one place, and it's rare that they're actually doing anything. You know, one of the people I actually liked talking to was the engineer who works on the javelins, and you have some good conversations with her, but all she ever does is stand next to the javelins. You know, you never see her working on something. She talks about working on stuff, but she's never actually in it. She's never actually doing stuff, and that's a little bit weird. You know, it's quite a small area, Fort Tarsis, but it feels like a drag getting about. They sped up the movement speed slightly for the second beta, and I think they're planning to introduce like a sprint option, which would be better. But overall, Fort Tarsis didn't really impress me. It was difficult to tell how the story will be, you know, because they kind of throw you in a little bit too late to get the initial setup, but too early for anything particularly dramatic to be happening. Not the best time to be engaged in the story, but I guess, you know, that's just kind of the nature of a beta. But hey, maybe that's just how the story will be the whole way through. I mean, there's charm to some of the conversations, but the thing I really found was there's a real lack of any sense of urgency. You know, there are some potentially serious things that happen during the demo storyline, but all the characters feel pretty laid back, and when there is danger, they don't really convey it very well. It's very sort of laid back, easygoing. Like I said, I enjoyed some of the conversations, like talking to the engineer in particular, but they give you these two inconsequential dialogue choices every so often, and it feels like they threw those in because they knew people liked making dialogue choices in BioWare games, and so they had to make some concession to that. But the choices feel kind of pointless. You know, you don't get a lot of options to dig into a character's backstory and ask them about, you know, what they were doing before we got here, or ask them what they're interested in or who they like or anything like that. They give you a codex equivalent, so there is some chance to look into some backstory there. I didn't spend a ton of time with it because, again, they throw you in midway into the story, and I didn't really want to dip in until I was committing fully to the overall arc. But overall, the conversations didn't really do it for me. So the other thing you do in Fort Tarsis is you do your mech customization and your loadout, and the mech customization is one of the things I can be just genuinely completely positive about, apart from the bit where it reset my entire loadout one time. I love the decision to split gear upgrades from cosmetics, generally speaking. You do get some on-gear bits. Like with the Colossus, I got a back piece that replaced my mortar launcher, and that changed, so there is some visual representation of the gear you're using, but the overall look of your mech is going to be completely customizable, separate from the equipment you have on. And they give you a range of different materials and colors, so you have hard materials, soft materials, you can have raw metal, you can have leather or rubber, and you can change the colors of all of them. You can make some really cool designs. The one concern I would have is that because there's no tie between equipment and the look of your mech, I'm just going to make one design for each mech that I like and then never switch from it. Unless some of the late game stuff starts unlocking new visual looks, which maybe it will do. It seems like you'll be able to buy cosmetic stuff, so maybe it'll be a case of unlocking things and purchasing things with late game materials that give you the cooler looking mechs. So maybe I will change it as I go on. I guess we'll see, like that remains to be seen. As for the mechs themselves, for the 4 classes of mech, the one they give you out the gate, the Ranger, I feel like the general consensus was that one was by far the least interesting. It's mostly gun focused. It's fine. I actually had some fun with it once I unlocked a few different skills to play around with that weren't just the base missile and grenade, but it's probably still the least interesting of them. I did say I did get it to max level because I wanted to spend a bit more time with it after I'd played the other classes to see what, like, well, maybe I do still like this core mech. It's okay. It's definitely the least unique of the 4, but that's fine. It is what it is. The Colossus ended up being my favorite. The difference with the Colossus, instead of a regenerating shield that just covers your whole body, you have a literal physical shield you can pull out and put in front of you, and that uses up your shield stat, and then when it runs out of charge you can put it away and it will recharge itself, which is very flexible compared to the other classes because you don't have to hide, you don't have to get out of combat to regenerate your shield. You just put it away and then you can get it back out again, and you have a ton of health as the Colossus, which means that you can really get in amongst it and tank. But one of the interesting things is you can't have the shield out and attack, so whereas with the other classes you can get behind cover, regenerate your shield, pop out and shoot and take a few hits. If you're low on health as a Colossus, your only way to heal up is to pick health drops off the floor, because the health doesn't regenerate, only the shield does, which means that you have to expose yourself, because to shoot your gun or to fire your flamethrower you have to put the shield down. So really what ends up happening is if you see health drops in the middle of the enemy. You have to just put your shield up and sort of charge headlong into the middle of danger, which is quite exciting and quite a good risk-reward mechanic. You know, you're going to charge in, I'm going to bash these two small guys with my shield, knock them down, get the health off them, and then maybe fly back out again. And it's actually nice because the Colossus also has a taunt mechanic where it can force enemies to attack it, and it feels much more like having a tank than anything that like Destiny does. Because Destiny has the Titan class, which is a little bit stronger, has a shield and stuff, but it never felt like a tank the way that the Colossus does. It doesn't feel like something where you're encouraging enemies to attack you to allow your teammates to flank around and do more damage without being focused on. I also really like the Interceptor. That was a ton of fun. It's very maneuverable. You can really bounce around and fly around. It's definitely the show-off mech, and it also gets this cool mechanic where we'll talk about combos later, but if you, for example, freeze or set an enemy on fire and then attack it with the Interceptor, you get a buff based on the element that was done to the enemy. So if you freeze an enemy and then hit it with your melee, then you're going to get the freeze buff on you, and the freeze buff means anything that you're near will be frozen. The fire buff, anything you're near will be set on fire. So you get to dash in with these melee combos that the Interceptor has, and you're just constantly freezing every enemy around you and then shattering them. And that's really cool. It's kind of like this fun way of integrating the combo system and doing these chain freezes or chain flames or chain acid attacks. And I really enjoyed doing that. And they get some good speed and precision. You get some high burst damage stuff, like you can throw shurikens that do a ton of damage if you can nail the weak spot, and they're quite restrictive with the aiming on them. You have to be a little bit more precise than you do with a lot of the weapons and skills, but if you can hit them, it feels really good. The Storm is the other class I haven't yet talked about. That does feel quite fun to play. That's kind of your space wizard. You get long hover times as the Storm. You can hang in the air for a long time, and when you're in the air you get a bonus sort of aerial shield that will protect you a little bit more, and you get to call lightning out the sky, and your ultimate is this big kind of 3 elemental blasts. It feels very cool, but it didn't quite grab me as much as the Colossus and the Interceptor did. Generally speaking, there are a lot of abilities across the classes. I'm sure there will be more that we didn't get to see in the demo, and it does feel like a natural evolution of Mass Effect's class system, where in Mass Effect 3 for the multiplayer, for example, there were a ton of different adepts, and each of them would have 3 skills from the sort of adept skill pool, whereas this, you have the 4 different classes of mech, and it's just like, hey, here's all of the Colossus skills, pick the 3 of them that you want. Say like, okay, I'm going to have the taunt, and I'm going to have the shock burst, and I'm going to have the flamethrower. Those are the 3 that I like. I think they work well together. This feels like a natural evolution of that Mass Effect system, and I enjoyed messing around with that and choosing my loadouts, and I'm sure that only gets more interesting as you get into the later game and you get more synergistic skills and talents. As for the rest of combat, the gunplay does feel a little bit flimsy. It was a little bit underwhelming with a lot of the weapons. I think the shotgun, the heavy pistol, and the explosive sniper rifle that you get felt quite a bit better, but on the whole, the guns were a little bit bland by comparison to the skills. I played a ton of Mass Effect 3 multiplayer, so that's always been a good touchstone point for me. I actually went back and played that just to compare, and there are a lot of fairly similar feeling guns, but also there are more interesting guns in Mass Effect 3 multiplayer. You get things like the Acolyte, which is a charging pistol. You get stuff like the Riga Carbine, which is kind of half shotgun, half lightning flamethrower. And there's nothing quite like that from what I've seen in Anthem, but maybe later on we'll get stuff like that. That's what I would hope. But like Mass Effect 3 multiplayer, I think the skills, the abilities are more what it's about. It's not so much about the gun combat. The guns are there to use when you're not using your abilities, but I think the abilities are going to be the focus. The combo system is really satisfying in this game. So if you've played Mass Effect multiplayer or even single player, you'll be familiar with the biotic explosions and the tech explosions, things like where you would warp an enemy and then throw them and you get the big explosion when the skills combo. And this has that, but it has it with, you know, their own set of skills where you can freeze an enemy and then you can detonate that to shatter the enemy. And each of the classes has a unique benefit from detonating a combo. So for example, the Ranger will deal a ton of extra single target damage when they detonate a combo on someone, whereas the Interceptor, as we talked about before, when you detonate a combo, you get a buff based on the status that was on the enemy. So they've done some really cool stuff with making the classes feel distinct and having it be where in a coordinated situation, you're going to want to arrange with your teammates, okay, this is a big single boss, so the ranger on our team is going to be the one to detonate combos because we want that single target damage. It's more important for burning this boss's health down. That's cool. I like that quite a bit. Probably my favorite combo example from the demo period was with the Colossus, where I had two skills, a flamethrower that's just a pretty bog standard point and shoot right in front of you flamethrower that sets things on fire, as you might expect, and then I had like a shock arc thing that would set up on your shoulder, and then periodically it will zap anything that's in front of you with electricity, and that will detonate enemies that are on fire. It will combo them. And the Colossus's combo bonus is that it does AoE damage to things around the target, not as much as the ranger's single target damage obviously, but what happens is that you pull these big groups towards you. Either you run into them or you taunt them to come towards you with the Colossus taunt, and then you're just gonna flame them all, and this zap 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 is gonna detonate them, and you just obliterate things. It's incredibly satisfying. It gives me that feeling of some of the most fun classes in Mass Effect multiplayer, where you just feel like I have this super OP combo that's devastating everything. I would note that I don't think they explain the combo system very well. None of my friends seemed to realise it was there until I told them it was, and I only knew it was there because I'd watched preview footage from the developers. As soon as I said, hey, it works like Mass Effect's biotic explosions and tech explosions, my friends understood what that meant because they'd played Mass Effect. But if you didn't, or if you just didn't watch any preview footage, you're maybe going to miss out on this for quite a while, and it's quite an important system, so I feel like they should explain it a little bit better than they do. Another thing I really liked, which I talked about briefly before, is the health drop mechanic. So you all have a shield. 3 of the classes just have a regular shield that takes damage as you get hit and then recharges when you're not being hit. The Colossus is slightly different because it has that physical shield that recharges when you put it away. But underneath the shield you have health of your mech, and the health depletes bar by bar, but it doesn't regenerate more than about a third of the bar naturally. So to regenerate any more than that, you have to pick up health drops off the floor, which most of the enemies seem to drop. There's ways you can get gear that increases the chance of health dropping, and that means you have to go in and grab health, which actually works pretty well. In other games I feel like maybe it would be troublesome because it forces you into sort of going in amongst the enemy, but here, because you have that flight and you have that quick movement, you can really zip in, and it's actually quite exciting to go, okay, there's health there between these enemies and they're closing in on me. I'm going to wait till they get close, and then I'm going to literally rocket over the top of them, fly past them, grab some of this health, slam into cover behind them, and then take them from behind. And that's really exciting. I like that. I felt like it actually worked quite a bit. At first I wasn't sure about how I'd feel, but repositioning or dashing in for a quick save is actually really fun, and especially so with the Colossus, because you get to go in with that big shield in front of you and just smash things out of the way, and that's really cool. The other thing they do is their difficulty settings are very much like Diablo, if you've played Diablo 3 in recent years, where you choose the difficulty you go in at, and that affects the health of enemies and the damage that enemies do, and it ramps up really quickly. So on normal everything has standard health, but then on hard everything has 300% extra health and damage, which is a big jump, and you get an extra 50% more chance to get max rarity loot for the level you're at, is how I think they describe it. So basically you're hugely ramping up the damage and the health of the enemies in return for a slightly better chance at getting the good gear more quickly, which is a cool thing. I feel like on hard I found it almost impossible to solo most encounters. Anything with more than a couple of enemies that were sort of major enemies, I just couldn't kill them in time. I couldn't get their shield down and then do enough damage to them, because by the time I'd taken their shield down, the other enemies had closed in on me and I needed to back off and regenerate my shield or pick up some more health, and so I needed to cooperate to succeed, which is, you know, that's actually fine. That's not necessarily a problem. The game's built around team play, so it's okay that that's the way it works. And if I wanted to play by myself, I could play on normal or easy. It doesn't stop you getting the loot, it just means you're going to get it slightly less quickly. When it works well, the combat feels really good. I actually did come around on it a lot the more I played it. At first I was kind of underwhelmed by the guns, but as I found guns I liked, and as I got more used to using the skills and unlocked more skills, I actually came around on the combat quite a bit. The problem I had, which I mentioned earlier, is that it felt quite laggy a lot of the time. It felt like I couldn't tell if it was frame dropping or if it was server lag, but I think it was probably more the latter, and that's definitely quite a letdown. And so as I said before, until you know that server issues are rectified, side, it becomes more difficult to recommend this game, no matter how much I do like parts of it. So we've talked about combat, we've talked about the different mechs and the combo system and the weapons and all that. So let's talk about the main mission structure, what you're actually doing, where you're going out to do all this combat. So the story missions feel very much like something like Destiny, where you get your mission from the hub world and then you go out and you pick your mission from the map, you go into it. You don't go into the open world and start it from there the way you would in Destiny 2. This is more like the old school first Destiny, where you're picking it from a menu, you're loading in, it's putting you into the open world, but you just do one mission and then you get booted back out to the menu, which is a little disappointing, but it is what it is. It runs into the same issue as the first Destiny, in fact, though, where I had multiple missions in a row where you just go back to the same place you were at in the previous mission, and that's disappointing. Like, I don't mind going back to the same place, but I'd rather I went somewhere else for a bit first, because if you just take me back to the same place over and over again, it just feels like I'm doing the same mission over and over again. Sure, there's slightly different motivation, and maybe there's slightly different enemies when I get to the location, but, you know, take me somewhere else. You know, show me the world, show me the map. The missions, as I mentioned, end very abruptly. There's almost no fanfare when you finish a mission. It just kind of ends suddenly, and I go, oh, that was it. And then 3 seconds, you're booted back to the menu, and I guess you then go back to the hub, and then you get another mission. They had one puzzle over the course of the missions outside of the combat stuff. The puzzle was okay. It didn't really make me feel smart the way good puzzles do. All that happens is that there are 3 symbols and you need to find what pattern to match the symbols up to. So all you do is you look around the environment until you find the symbols, and then you match them up to where they are on the walls, which doesn't really make you feel clever, because you spend a while wondering what you need to do, and then as soon as you see it, you know the answer. There's no puzzle to it. The puzzle is just, can you spot the things that we left around the map, which is fine, but I would like to see something a little bit more taxing or a little bit more thought involved. The other thing that they have is the stronghold mission, which you get, I think you have access to it the whole time, but the implication is you shouldn't do it until you've leveled up a bit from the story. This is reminiscent of a dungeon from an MMO, or, you know, Destiny Strikes, to talk about Destiny again, where you do several big encounters. There's lots of hold this point until this meter fills up and it unlocks a door, carry these things in, and hordes of enemies will come in, and one of you has to carry an orb and dunk it in a pot. In fact, there is a huge amount of dunking orbs, which is more fun, I think, than it is in something like Destiny, because of the flight, because you can do that big risky, okay, there's an orb over there behind those enemies, I'm going to try and fly around them, swing around the environment, grab the orb, and then fly back out again. And if you can put it off, it feels really cool. And it all leads up to a big end boss. The end boss is fine. It's like this big sort of spidery thing with big pustules on its back that you can shoot and blow up. She basically one-shots you if she hits you with her melee, which I think, I'm normally a little bit wary of that, but I think it works here again because of the movement, because it encourages you when the boss gets near to you to fly away, swing out and get far away again, use that maneuverability that Anthem gives you. I would say the boss was very bullet spongy and didn't really mix things up over the course of the battle. It was just shoot the boss until the boss leaves, and then a swarm of things come in, you kill the swarm of ads, and then the boss comes back, you hit the boss runs away, the ads come back in, maybe there's more of them this time, and you just do that 4, 5, 6 times over until the boss dies. It's fine, but it's not particularly exciting after the first couple of rotations. You're just doing the same thing you just did, and if you did it the first time and the second time, you can probably do it the remaining 3 or 4 times. So, I don't know, it is what it is. It was fine, and I got some gear from it, I guess, but the gear didn't feel special. I would have liked to have seen something unique to the stronghold, especially given that it doesn't sound like strongholds that are going to be super numerous. There'll just be a few of them, especially through the campaign. I think they said there's this one in the campaign, most of the rest are endgame. So, you know, give me some unique gear that is sort of tied to that stronghold thematically. That would make it much more interesting, I think. That would make it much more appealing to do that stronghold versus doing something else. Like, I'm sure the drop rates are better from the stronghold, but it's quite a big time investment, especially the first time through, and I'm sure if you're doing it on harder difficulties, it's quite a big time investment. Give me something exciting from it. Give me something specific to that stronghold that's going to make me want to come back and do that stronghold again. So that's it for the authored content in the demo. The other thing you could do, which I spent actually a surprising amount of time doing, it really kind of hooked me in, was wandering about the open world and just flying around and shooting stuff. And I think it just feels good to do that. The open world is very well built for the flight. There's lots of big dives down cliffs, and diving down lets you cool your javelin so it doesn't overheat. And if you use the dive well, you can really get a lot of extra distance out of a single flight, I guess. The other thing you can do is get near near water, and there's lots of water all over the environment, and if you're flying over the top of water quite close to it, or if you go through a waterfall, then that will cool your mech down as well and give you a lot more time to fly. And there's also some areas where, hey, I need to get up to this high cliff and I need to more strategically manage my heats to get up there. The environment's super pretty, but I would say it's not particularly memorable. It's very generic sci-fi. There were a few cool moments. There was a moment where I flew at a waterfall to see if I would go through it, and I flew in and suddenly I was just underwater in this cave, and I dove down and I came out in like a little crystal cavern, and that was really cool. And there was a chest in there that gave me a random bit of loot and nothing really else, which maybe that'll be story related. It was really cool in the moment though. I hope there's more of that to discover, because those little environmental secrets are really fun to encounter. But for the most part, I would say the whole thing, other than that, wasn't particularly memorable. I kind of grew to know all of the areas individually, but I never really learned how they connected, and I played for hours and hours. You know, I probably put a good 10 or so hours into just being in the open world, and yet I would work out, hey, I know these two areas are adjacent because I keep going between them, but I have no idea what's round the next corner. And then I would go around and say, oh, it's this place, okay, sure, but I was still struggling to remember how the world interconnected, and I feel like that speaks to how generic it felt at times. But wandering around and killing stuff's really fun. The random events gave you a little bit more focus during the open world sessions, but there's no indication of when they spawn. You know, games like Destiny 2 and Final Fantasy 14 do a really good job of just putting it on your map and saying, hey, go here, do the cool thing, do the public event with everyone else. And I think that makes sense. You do get an indication if you're sort of near to them, but you have to get quite close for it to pop up on your map or to pop up on the screen, and so you could easily miss them. It's more interesting to do when everyone comes together to do them, and especially if you're on hard, like I mentioned earlier, you kind of need everyone to come together and do them. So it would behoove them, I think, just to show it for everyone regardless of where they were in the encounter. I'd also say that the random events were perhaps a little bit sparse. Like, it didn't feel like they were happening super often, and maybe it was just that I was missing them because they weren't showing up on the map, but I felt like I was flying all over the place, and they don't happen quite as often as I'd like, because that's all there is to do in free roam for the most part. The one thing they did do was at the end of the second weekend, they did an event which they were sort of teasing, hey, maybe this is something that will hint at what might be to come in the later game of Anthem. And there was this huge stormy tear in the sky, which was quite exciting, and it made very Mass Effect Reaper style noises kind of thing, which, hey, whatever, that is what it is. But it looks cool, but all it amounted to was, hey, there's a few more titans around the map, and occasionally you'll run into this ancient ash titan, which is a slightly stronger one. And I will say, fighting the titans is quite fun because they do these wave stomps and things like that. It's almost like a Crash Bandicoot boss or something, where they're doing these attacks that you have to maneuver around, and that's actually quite exciting compared to a lot of Destiny bosses that frequently amount to just hide from their big gun and then shoot them when they're not looking at you. This felt a little bit more interesting, but the thing that the enemy bosses don't do in Anthem quite a lot of the time is move around. Oftentimes they just kind of stand in one place and do their attacks, and that's a little bit dull. So yeah, I don't know. There was a tease of what might come, I guess, that event, but it wasn't the most compelling tease really, so we'll see what comes of that. Okay, I've already been talking for way too long, and I haven't spoken to the loot yet, so before we wrap up, let's speak to loot specifically. So the loot felt like it came at a reasonably decent pace. In the moment, I felt like I wasn't getting a ton of it, the way that I sometimes do in other games, but actually, thinking back on it, I always had a decent amount after each outing, and I wasn't being overloaded to the point where it became unmanageable. The thing I would say is actually, I felt like there was too much repetition in the weapon drops, so I wasn't getting as many of the skills of like the missiles and the grenades and the flamethrowers and stuff, but I was getting a ton of weapons, and oftentimes I was getting like 5 of the same pistol and 5 of the same shotgun, and that was a little bit boring. I don't want a ton of the same shotgun that are marginally better or worse than each other. I want a bit more variety to what I'm getting. Maybe that would vary up as you get into the later game. Hopefully it will. The skills and equipment feel more important than the guns do as well, so I would naturally want more of those. They're more exciting to me because that's what really changes up how the game plays, whereas the weapons, the guns are just guns, you know, you point them and you shoot them. The skills are a little bit more integral to varying up your gameplay the way you like it. The crafting system I played around with a little bit, and that works okay. So I think the way it works, from what I can tell, is that you need materials which are collected from dismantling gear you don't want and from random sort of nodes in the environment, mushrooms and stuff, and ore spots and bits of scrap metal that you can pick up. And when you've got enough bits and pieces, you can craft guns, but the rarity of gun you can craft seems to be based on the number of kills you've got with that gun. And ostensibly that's a good mechanic of like, okay, I've used this shotgun enough that I can make a rare version of it, and if I continue to use it, then I can make the epic version of it. So sort of the more time I spend with a gun, the better tier of it I can craft, and the same with the skills. The problem is that, especially with the skills, oftentimes I was using them for setup. So with the Ranger, I had these acid missiles that I really liked using. They did a ton of damage to armored enemies, but the other thing is that they apply acid to a target, and then I could detonate it with my Ranger skill. That means I do a ton of single target damage. But what was happening was I was using the acid rounds to set the combo up and not to actually do the kill, because the kill came from detonating the combo. So I wasn't actually getting very many kills with my acid rounds, which meant that I wasn't unlocking higher tier crafting for the acid rounds. And that was a little bit weird. Maybe there's a way to do it where anywhere it's used in a kill or anywhere it deals damage is counted towards that overall crafting level. I don't know. I'm not a game balancer, but I did run into that and think it was perhaps a potential issue. The other thing, as I mentioned before, is doing the stronghold didn't give me the unique kind of loot I would have liked to have seen. It was the same loot from anywhere else. Maybe it was slightly rarer on average, but I want to see something that says, hey, I did this stronghold and I got this cool gun, you know. I beat the spider boss at the end of the stronghold and I got this web gun, or, you know, maybe that's a bit cliche, but something along those lines, you know. So let's wrap things up, because this has gone on for over half an hour and that's too long. And if you're still here, thank you for being here and listening to me ramble. So in conclusion, Anthem's really fun mechanically when it's working, and I think there's a lot of potential with the gear from watching preview streams and seeing what some of the end game can be, and, you know, trying it out in action. I think that there is a lot of potential there for cool builds and stuff, and seeing how they vary in the later game seems pretty cool. I hope the weapons vary up more as you scale up through the levels, because the standard weapons at sort of level 10 to 12 are fine but kind of bland, and I want to see some more variety there. It's a shame we didn't get much of a taste of what could come from the later game, and that it was so restricted to level 15, which is fine. I get why they do that, but also, how am I supposed to judge what the end game is like if you're not going to show me any of it in the demo? If you enjoy Mass Effect multiplayer as much as I do, then I would say Anthem feels kind of like that in an open world, except that you have power suits and you can fly around. That for me is kind of enough to make me want to play it. I would say story-wise the jury's really out. You know, there's been a lot of talk about how this is not the kind of game BioWare is known for making. They've always been a narrative-heavy studio, but I would say also a lot of the staff have probably changed over the years, and maybe that's not the kind of game they're interested in making anymore. And hey, let's be real, the last narrative game that they put out, Mass Effect Andromeda, was not particularly well received for its narrative, so maybe that's just not what they're looking to do anymore. Maybe that's not to their strength these days. What I will say is the combat felt good. There were some characters I wanted to spend more time with, but not to the extent where I would rush out and buy the game just to see more of those characters. Just like, if I happened to be playing it because I liked the way the game felt, then I'd be interested to see what happened to these characters down the line. But I would say the characters I was interested in were not the ones that were particularly story significant. So I don't know what that says about the story. Overall, I enjoyed playing it, and it did keep me coming back. You know, I found myself, even with nothing to do, just going into the open world and shooting stuff, because there was something strangely compelling about it. And hey, I played tons and tons of Mass Effect multiplayer, so there's something about that style of combat that just works for me. But with all the server issues, all of the hitchiness over the weekend, and the fact that that didn't ever get resolved even by the end of the second weekend, I think it's a hard sell. I have to recommend holding off at launch and seeing how the servers hold up. If it sounds interesting to you, if you did like Mass Effect multiplayer, keep an eye on it, because I think gameplay wise there is a ton of potential there, especially with the end game builds and stuff, especially with some of the more interesting mechs. There's a ton of fun to be had in the gameplay, but I'm not sold on the story. I'm definitely not sold on their ability to put a consistent server system in place for an online game. And granted, the internet's very difficult, but to see a game like Apex Legends launch this week from EA and run perfectly, it makes this look kind of bad by comparison. And granted, that's coming from a company, Respawn, who have spent over a decade making online shooters. So guess what? They're good at making online shooters work. BioWare, I mean, whatever, they put out an MMO, I guess, and a well-received one at that. You know, I enjoyed playing The Old Republic for quite a bit, but I am unconvinced that the servers are going to hold up super well. I'm unconvinced that they're going to solve that lagginess, and until I see that, I'm not going to recommend it. But I think there's potential there, and I really do hope that they deliver on it, because I want all games to be good, and I think there is absolutely a good game in here. It's just whether the technical issues hold it back or not. So thanks very much for watching. If you somehow made it to the end of this, thank you so much for listening to me ramble unnecessarily for almost 40 minutes. Sorry for taking up so much of your time, I guess. If you played the beta and you want to talk about what you thought of it, I'd love to hear, you know, drop it in the comments below, reach out to me on Twitter, whatever works for you. If you enjoyed this video, a like would mean the world to me. If you want to subscribe to the channel, I'll be doing stuff that is probably mostly not going to be me rambling about betas in the future. So yeah, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Cheers!